I call the honourable member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there's a very simple reason why this bill should be going to Select Committee for longer than 2 months, and that's that this issue is too important to get it wrong. This issue is too important to risk making mistakes, and this issue is so complex that 2 months simply is not long enough to actually give it the proper consideration that it deserves. And this is something that we've seen from this National Party time and time again, these truncated Select Committee processes. And the Minister of Housing knows all too well what a dog's breakfast that causes, because he sat on the very truncated Emissions Trading Scheme Select Committee that got 7 weeks at Select Committee, a similar period of time. It was a complete waste of time. It was a waste of the officials' time. It was a rubber stamping exercise that was clear from the outset. We were deliberating when we hadn't even received final advice from officials on key issues, and that is not to criticise the officials, because they did everything they could, given the absolutely impossible hand that they were dealt by this national-led government. So that's what happens when you have Select Committee processes. And I find it extraordinary that we're getting these truncated processes on pieces of legislation concerning issues that are so complex and so critically important, like housing affordability or New Zealand's emissions trading schemes. Arguably, these are issues that require far more thought and far more information and far more consideration than some of the much simpler pieces of legislation that go to Select Committee for months on end. So I don't know why the National Party are insistent on ramming this through, unless they don't want the scrutiny that a proper Select Committee process would deliver. Because the Honourable Nick Smith said earlier that the opposition didn't like this because we're scared of hard work. It's actually the opposite, Dr Smith. No work goes into these bills when they go to Select Committee for 7 weeks or 8 weeks. You know that as well as I do, because Dr Smith was a member of a committee that had that. So Anne Tolley says it's about being lazy. We actually want to do proper work on this bill. We want to have a process that really allows proper scrutiny and consideration. We want to work hard on this piece of legislation. It's the government that is preventing that from happening by having a process which by its very nature is going to make it far more difficult for people to submit, far more difficult for key stakeholders to submit, far more difficult for the Select Committee to officials to provide an in-depth departmental report, far more difficult for the members of that Select Committee to then challenge aspects of that support, to then ask for further information, to then deal with issues which may arise during that process, far more difficult for members of that committee or for officials, to get the drafting done properly, and the drafting, as we all know, is key, and far more difficult for members of that Select Committee to be able to scrutinise that drafting and to make sure that what was being agreed in terms of what's put in place is actually what ends up in the drafting, because that's a very important work that Select Committees do. And if the National Party don't value that work, then they should just come out and say so. Because if they do value it, then there is absolutely no reason why there should be a 2-month deadline at Select Committee. Key stakeholders haven't been, across the country, outside of Auckland in particular, haven't been talked to about this. They haven't had time to consider what it means to them. And that is critical, because while Auckland has its unitary plan, has been talking to the government, this is going to apply across the board. And the issues for different councils are going to vary greatly. And we need to make sure that we've taken the time to talk to local government in New Zealand, to talk to the various councils who are now going to have to hurriedly kind of try and rush and push something together to get it to Select Committee when, I mean, the bill is just a bare bones. We don't really know what it's going to mean for those other councils. We could have the opportunity to actually do that work if we had longer than 8 weeks at Select Committee. The reality is the government doesn't want that work done. We're doing this because they're desperate to look, after 5 years, they're desperate to look as though they're actually doing something about housing. The only reason we're actually passing this legislation is because they were spooked by Labor's housing announcement last year, because finally the public saw that there was a choice between a government that would do something about housing and housing affordability to take it seriously, and the current government that in 5 years has done absolutely nothing except repeal every single piece of legislation we put in place. And what a good Select Committee process would give us the opportunity to do would be to consider what are going to be the likely implications for the various councils, because housing affordability is not just as simple as looking at the cost of a house. You actually have to look at the relative income of the places where people are purchasing the houses as well. So something that might seem affordable to people on an income in Auckland, on the North Shore, perhaps where Maggie Barry comes from. She's been very vocal in this debate with no, I wasn't. I was just mentioning that. I was just mentioning that you were from the North Shore, Ms. Barry. That was all. That was all. Slightly sensitive. Just calm down. Take a few deep breaths. I didn't realise that telling people you were from the North Shore was such an insult, and you were so ashamed of it. Now I know. I will never mention it again. Never mention it again. You're not from the North Shore. She's not from the North Shore. I withdraw and apologise, Mr. Speaker. Withdraw and apologise. But the issue that I was trying to raise before Ms. Barry did what she does was that the average income on the North Shore and the average price of housing is going to be very different from what it is in Gisborne. And a house that looks affordable to someone who is used to the Auckland housing market might not be that affordable.
Point of order, the honourable member.
Same point of order again. The member is now straying well away from the point of this particular question, and I ask you to bring her back to the question or to resume her seat.
Well, can I just say to the members that the debate really is on the point that the committee report by an early date and giving certain powers for the committee to meet. That's the narrow focus of the debate. That's right. I call the honourable member Moana Maki.
That's the most sensible thing Phil Heatley said all night.
Philip Heatley, you should know.
The point that I was making was, of course, that 2 months is simply not long enough to consider. I was responding to Ms. Barry's interjections just as I'm responding to yours now. So if you want me to get back to the substance of the thing, I suggest you just, and then I will do that. So the point that I was making was 2 months on an issue this complicated is simply not long enough. It's simply not long enough on an issue this complicated. So I say to the government, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid might come up at Select Committee that they need to truncate the process and not have the adequate time to consider these things? Because I remember when we were in government and we had similar issues come up, we often had longer time periods. We had inquiries into these kind of issues. We allowed Select Committees to do the work that they do. And Select Committees should be allowed to do the work that they do, and when they're given such ridiculously short time frames, they simply are not able to do so. And my concern is that the truncated timeline could actually result in not just legislation that actually doesn't do anything, which is a risk with this piece of legislation, but could end up with legislation that actually does damage because it's not carefully thought through. Because rushed law is bad law. Rushed lawmaking is bad lawmaking. And if the government really wants to take this issue seriously, and I know it's all a joke to Phil Heatley, all a big laugh, you know, he's all right, he's done okay, so why should we make sure that the rest of the people in New Zealand can have access to affordable housing? What, you've got 4 houses? Yeah, I don't know why you told me that, but anyway. That was really random. Anyway, the point is that there is a danger. There is a danger that we actually make bad mistakes when we rush lawmaking, that we actually end up with unintended consequences that wouldn't occur if we simply allowed the normal. We're not asking for more time than a Select Committee normally gets. If you simply allowed for the proper course of a Select Committee to take place. Mr. Speaker, there's a reason why there's a generally understood time frame for Select Committees. It's because that is what practice and what experience has told us is the time it takes for officials to do the work that they need to do, for submitters to be able to find out about the legislation, put that work together, send it to a Select Committee, for members to actually be able to read the submissions that come in. And National Party members might not read the submissions that come to Select Committees, but members on this side of the House do. And then for the officials to go away and do that work and for the committee to deliberate. That's what they do. And over a period of years, we have come to an understanding in this House about how long that process generally is. And sometimes we've been happy to support the government where we've seen that there is a real reason and a cause for a short time frame at Select Committee. And sometimes there are very real and legitimate reasons why that needs to happen, and where there are legitimate reasons, we are always happy to assist the government in that matter. But there is no legitimate reason for such a truncated time frame on this piece of legislation. If we're going to do it, let's do it right, and let's make sure it's done right. The reality is the government doesn't care about doing it right. They just care about looking like they're doing something.
I call the honourable member Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a